Stanford University.
You're on. Okay. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name's Dennis Allison, and with Andy Freeman, who is currently swimming with the fishes. He'll be back next week. Yes, he's a scuba diver. In any case, I'm here today, and I will tell you a little bit about what's coming up for next couple of weeks. 2 weeks from today, Mike Flynn, who's a Stanford EE Professor Emeritus and an advisor to a company called Maxler, is going to speak on accelerating computation and seismic data processing. And next week, Volker Strumpfen from IBM Austin Research is going to speak on the spiral cache, a self-organizing memory architecture. There are papers on that cache on his website, which is cited in the abstract. And it's very interesting. I recommend you read the papers before you come. Before we launch into the presentation today, I want to give you a bit of a background, because this is a little unusual for the 380 format. As many of you know, I've been very concerned about the collapse of the financial system. I've been looking for speakers in this particular area. And as a computer scientist, I've been surprised that there are really no set of sophisticated quantitative computer models to guide us out of the current crisis. And there doesn't seem to be any group working on such models. I talked to hundreds of people in the past few months, and no one seems to be doing anything. They all think it's a great idea, but no one is doing any work. The problems are complex, but they don't appear to be any more than an order of magnitude or two more complicated than, say, the weather prediction problem. So that sort of makes them tractable. Aha, we have computer scientists in the crowd. Anyhow, there are really unresolved problems about how to do it. These are emergent phenomena with open rather than closed systems, and it's not at all clear how you can model those in a stable way. But I suspect that we have people around who can help to figure that out. It's a research problem, and that means there's a potential for failure, but that's the nature of research. I was also surprised that when we found ourselves in this situation, there was no national initiative to develop such a model or models, and one that incorporates all the dependencies and resource limitations and complexities of the real world. I think that this is, in some sense, an evangelism for that kind of modeling. I'm pretty sure today that world leaders make their decisions based on the seat of their pants or their fingers sticking in the wind, using tools whose relevance is essentially the same as the examination of pigeon entrails, casting jaw strips, or astrological calculations. Worse, my investments seem to be managed by somebody who flips a coin. So anyhow, I've been reading about economics, and I'm really disturbed. Much of the body of academic economics, the discipline does not seem to be grounded in testable scientific reality. There's no way to test the propositions. And neoclassical economics doesn't seem to cut the mustard at the moment.
Well, what do you use the word dismal?
Dismal's fine. In any case, I will say this. Economics, as presented today, is fascinating. The mathematics is extremely interesting, and it doesn't seem to relate to the real world. In any case, we've committed many billions of dollars towards getting us out of this mess, stabilization, bailouts, stimulus packages, and the like. And I do think that we could afford a reasonable amount of money, a few percent of that trillions of dollars, to perhaps try to find a way to understand what actually is going on. I think it has to be a broadly based operation where we draw ideas from economics, but also from computer science and biology and physics and chemistry and mathematics, sociology, psychology, whatever, and try to build a collection of pragmatic tools which can help the decision makers to find a way to do things. Eric called his proposal here a economic Manhattan Project. And that may be a poor choice because of the atomic weapons tie-in, but that project was unusual in a couple of senses. It was a small interdisciplinary task force with a single shared goal which did its task and then dissolved to be replaced by a less agile and more durable bureaucracy. It was a response to a crisis situation, and it worked. Anyhow, these are interesting times. We've got lots of real crises, financial system breakdown, global warming, fossil fuel depletion, trade imbalances, food supply limitations, water supply limitations, diminishing return on investment and social complexity, potential flu pandemic, and a melting of the Arctic ice cap and other things, possible asteroid collisions and other black swans on events. But the interesting thing is that all these things are, as Ted Nelson would say, intertwinkled. And you can't really talk about the financial system without dealing with all of the rest of the systems which are potentially in crisis. So anyhow, history of the presentation. John Brockman, who runs edge.org, published in December a paper by Mike Brown, Stu Kaufman, Zoe Vanna Palmrose, and Lee Smolin, titled, "Can Science Help Solve the Economic Crisis?" Along with that came a number of comments from a number of different people, including Eric Weissman and Paul Romer. The lead to the article actually is a pretty good summary of what we're talking about. The economic crisis has to be stabilized immediately. This has to be carried out pragmatically without undue ideology and without reliance on failed ideas and assumptions which led to the crisis. And then Eric Weissman has spoken about an economic Manhattan Project. This means getting a group of good scientists together, some who know a lot about economics and finance, and others who have proved themselves in other areas of science, but bring fresh minds and perspectives to the challenge, to focus on developing a scientific conceptualization of economic theory and modeling that's reliable enough to be called science. Paul Romer, who is a professor here at Stanford of economics in the business school, wrote a commentary and in the subsequent discussion where he said, "I guess that these outsiders are supposed to purge economics and finance of the aforementioned ideology and failed assumptions. But before we put up money for an economic Manhattan Project, shouldn't it make sense to ask if there is any evidence to support the basic claim here that more theory developed by people who don't have domain experience is the key to scientific progress in macroeconomics and finance?" So I asked Paul if he would be willing to debate Eric before this forum, at least, at a time of his choosing on this particular topic, and he declined. But nonetheless, Eric agreed to argue the affirmative case for an economic Manhattan Project. So let's welcome Eric Weinstein, a principal of the Natron Group in New York, and the individual who proposed an economic Manhattan Project as a way to stabilize the current financial crisis. Excuse me.
Dennis, did you say why he declined?
Because he did not want to have to defend what he said, apparently, before an audience. And he was very busy.
Good talk.
So anyhow, welcome.
Thank you very much. So one of the stipulations was that if I was going to come out here and put my on the line, that we had to have this structured in such a way that we could use an economic tool, which I'm going to have to disagree with Dennis here, I think is very valuable and works really, really well. It's called revealed preference. You had two people, one of whom chose to write in to edge.org, taking whatever time out of their busy schedule to say some not very nice things. And another one of which decided to say, I will defend this in front of a live audience, come what may, and take the risk. Now the question is, how do you make that structured so that when one person doesn't show up, it's possible to infer something about the relative strength of the arguments, because otherwise you create, economists out there, I hope you understand this, an incentive structure to go after the reputations of people who may know what they're talking about, and then obscure what it is that you are doing by ducking out, claiming that you're too busy to do the work. So we agreed that we would set an empty chair. There are some people who feel that that may be in bad taste, and I can understand that, and I'm sympathetic. This is not my usual modality, and I'm sorry if that's offensive. So I thought, instead of setting an empty chair, well,
Speaking of offensive.
so no, I mean, even though it looks really, really angry, I think all it wants is a big hug. So if I need to talk to Paul, he'll be right there. I want to talk about three things really today. And those three things are going to crop up in response to some questions. So are we projecting? Am I projecting?
You are. They are not.
While we are sorting this out,
She's counting down right now.
do I need to...
There we go.
Okay. I want to say two things just about debating Paul here. One is the last time I was out at Stanford was about 10 years ago, and I had a very interesting time in the economics department. I met a lot of terrific people. In particular, I thought Ken Arrow was stunningly good as a scientist, and the fact that he chose to do his science in economics didn't detract at all from his science. But without question, the most remarkable person I met and spent time with was Paul Romer. And it was a magical afternoon intellectually. Finally, somebody who understood many of the nuances of the theory, who was unafraid to critique the neoclassical canon, somebody who was pushing the boundaries. I don't know what happened to that person. I am not looking to have a fight with that person. I do not understand the character assassinations that are going on currently in the academic sphere. I am simply looking to put an end, in some sense, to debates that are not done on the merits of the ideas, but are instead done on the credentials of the individuals. So I will try to spare the economist, Paul Romer, who I very much admire, my ire here in this case. I'm really only after the gunfighter. Now, today's big questions are, first of all, what is the Economic Manhattan Project? Second of all, why create something associated with elitism, machismo, death, and destruction? Third point, putting aside question 2, please, 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 can I join? Why am I not on the inner circle? And lastly, what did Paul Romer challenge the Economic Manhattan Project to show, and just where is he? So let's deal with these things by structuring in thirds. The first thing I want to do is I want to take seriously Romer's challenge because I actually like it. I think it's sharp. The fact is that it's courageous to put something out there that can be refuted. This is what the essence of the scientific method is about. Now, the fact of the matter is that while I do not like the way in which it is phrased, I am a huge fan of academic derision when done well, but it is supposed to be done sparingly, like habanero pepper, right? Very little goes a long way. Second of all, I want to discuss the important role of academic derision. And lastly, I want to discuss the Economic Manhattan Project, which is what hopefully we are going to do together to make sure that we, the technically gifted, those of us who have put our time and energies into acquiring technical toolkits, put those toolkits in service, at the service of the country at a time of crisis. So let's begin with where this difference is and how sharp it is. So from one perspective, you are much safer with experts who have good data than with people crossing boundaries, opportunistically looking for new problems, trying to figure out where they can use their screwdriver in case there are screws and other problems. And of course, they may find nails and make a hash of it. The other perspective is that sometimes a field or an area can be so thoroughly compromised that you are better off with people coming in from outside the field who do not have some of the preconceived notions and who are more capable of advancing the field. We've certainly seen examples of both, but I will point to the stunning success of physics. I was not trained in a physics department, I was trained in a math department. So we had the experience of being invaded by physicists starting in the middle of the 70s. And I remember going into the physics department at Harvard to ask a question, and a string theorist said to me, a mathematician. He said, you think of this as a great renaissance between our two fields, but I see it differently. And I said, well, how's that? He says, well, we've only learned two things from the interaction. I said, they are? And he said, one, we are much, much smarter than the mathematicians. I said, okay. And the second, he said, our notation sucks. Well, I think we did more than lend good notation to the physicists, but we've had a renaissance ever since. And if they are somewhat overbearing and testosterone-fueled, they're also incredibly gifted, and the invasion has been hugely beneficial for both subjects. I don't need to reiterate, I think, what physics did for biology during its golden era when the central dogma was being established. But many of the people we think of as the greatest biologists were actually physicists crossing boundaries. So I've highlighted some terms. Now, I had two quibbles with what Paul chose to say. One, I believed that he is the key to scientific progress, which should be a key, because I'm certainly not going to say this is the only thing that can advance the field, nor was there any indication that I would have thought that. The other is, it's the economic Manhattan Project, not the macroeconomics and finance Manhattan Project. So with those two quibbles, I am willing to take this on, even though my guess is Paul never actually intended it to be taken up. It's sort of there to scare people off. But I am foolish enough to think that the time has come to actually face down this difference between our fields till we get to some sort of sharp disagreement. So I'm prepared to see this to the end, and I'm prepared to take personal risk in terms of my reputation and fight this out. Now, can I open the board?
Actually, use the paper that's there. We'll use the camera.
Right on it, the camera will take it. The overhead camera.
This is cool.
It's technology.
Okay. My goal is to make one stop at Stanford to get a next invitation from Harvard.
This is the Harvard of the West.
And my third one will be to Chicago to debate Dale Jorgensen and Gary Becker next. And again, what I need is for people to invite me, make the challenge, make it clean, make sure that every opportunity is afforded to the opponent so that they can schedule things. It's not an imposition on their time. Equal time should be given to both sides. And the topics will be whether or not economics needs a new marginalism, and I will take whatever happens on a webcast as long as it's videotaped. Nothing behind closed doors. That's the rule. So let's start by establishing these points. First of all, am I truly an outsider? Even though I actually have a passion for economics and really appreciate its beauty, majesty, and scientific aspects, I I can certify that I am not a professor of economics and I have never taken a single class in the subject. And while I am a critic, it is definitely a love-hate relationship.
You haven't read von Neumann and Morgenstern.
I have read von Neumann and Morgenstern. I have even used von Neumann and Morgenstern. They will come up in the remainder of the talk. Ideology and failed assumptions. Since the challenge is mine, I choose the assumption that preferences and tastes are perfectly stable and invariant between individuals. All right, you will see that later on Gary Becker will assert that all individuals have the same preferences and they are unchanging in time. Now that is a mind bender. I give you the following puzzle, which I think I know how he would solve, but it is Gary Becker says preferences are the same to all men. I think Gary Becker's theory is lousy. Therefore, Gary Becker thinks Gary Becker's theory is lousy. He would argue that his endowment is higher than mine, and so he appreciates it, and it's only an issue of parameterization. And I would argue that at a minimum, I know more gauge theory than he does, and that's why we have the difference. Domain experience. I have never published on either index numbers or on welfare theory, which will form the heart of this challenge. Millions of dollars. I don't recall asking for millions of dollars. In fact, we are doing this on a shoestring, and we are hoping that people who are well-heeled and looking to do good for the world come through. But in general, this has not been an approach to the federal government. And what I have to say I find very, very surprising is that in the middle of a stimulus package, when people are trying to give away money to stimulate the economy, the fear is we will give this money to people with fancy scientific degrees who might look at the economic theory. That's a mind bender. All right, is there any evidence, Paul cries out, that more theory is the key to scientific progress? All I need is one shred. All right, a down payment. Instead of one shred, let's go for it. Seriously, let's dream bigger the way we used to dream bigger. I am a product of the American educational establishment, but I think of myself as a product of the pre-1970s university before we hit steady state and all of these other sociologies sort of crept into the scientific process. So I read a lot of history and I try to think about how things were back then. And whether I succeed or I fail, hopefully it will be because we took serious risk and that it was worth it. We are going to try to come up with a new marginalism. What is marginalism? It is the penetration of the differential calculus into economics. Now the original differential calculus was pretty good, but there have been developments since then, and those have been spectacularly successful, whether it's linear programming or stochastic differential calculus, which led to option pricing formula. Every time the differential calculus has found a new way in, great things have happened for economics. Well, the point here is to push the most advanced version of the calculus, by my way of thinking, called gauge theory, into economics by finding a completely natural example and a problem that cries out for solution. All right, now, in the center of my love-hate relationship with this field is the fact that economists are the subject matter is much more appealing than the sociology of the discipline. If you could strip the sociology of the discipline away, you really have an incredible toolkit, very deep insights, and tremendous opportunities. Even if you don't like the contact made with the outside world, think about quantum electrodynamics before the renormalization program came through, where you had a fairly complete theory, but you had some sort of a technical flaw that rendered it impossible to calculate. That drove many of the originators of the quantum theory to look for radical solutions, but the solutions that worked were in fact conservative. Even Feynman's was effectively a conservative solution. So, in this matter, the economists have a view, and the view is that they are technical and they are scientific, and that others who don't accept the theory in general are weak-kneed, don't have strong stomachs, stiff spines, they don't have the guts, the courage to look at the human condition and view us as self-interested actors constantly on the make to maximize something. These are not our problems. Anybody who understands selection and biology at a very high level doesn't have an issue with the sentimentality of economists. In fact, if anything, they are too sentimental about things like the invisible hand and not able to look, I think, life as in the eyes the way the biologists do. So, what I'm going to choose, because we have some experience with it, is an incident from around 1996, which is my interaction with the Boskin Commission, largely through my wife, in which the Boskin Commission sought to change the way inflation was measured in the United States by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the idea was that there was some kind of an overstatement in the rate of inflation. Now, there are two things indexed to the rate of inflation that bear mentioning: entitlements and tax brackets. So anything you do to the gauge of price inflation has tremendous redistributive consequences. And what the Boskin Commission is telling us here, in fact, we're going to use Robert Gordon as our guide to what happened, is that they used scientific and technical means to arrive at the 1.1% overstatement estimate, but that the AARP and other political entities scuttled the proposed scientific changes to an indicator. Now, that's a pretty hefty criticism of something like the AARP, because they're saying that they are messing with the fundamental gauges with which everyone is trying to measure what is happening in the economy to suit political ends. Let's see whether that bears scrutiny. Now, what we did not have in 1996 was a description of what happened inside the Boskin Commission. This only occurred later when Gordon started writing about this in a series of PowerPoint presentations and articles. And the rumor that my wife and I encountered at the time was that our work, which dealt with how to do this correctly and scientifically, was scuttled, and this is a terrible rumor, because there was a 1.1% target, and that anything that changed methodology would blow the Boskin Commission off of its 1.1% target. Now, that's scandalous, of course, because that's tantamount to saying that this was not a scientific endeavor by 5 prominent economists, and we never knew what the disposition was that, because our intelligence wasn't good enough in that area. But Gordon starts saying, we took 27 industries, said we knew nothing relevant for about 9 of them. The other 18, we came up with a precise number. What chutzpah. We scribbled on the back of a very big envelope. That's pretty bad, but wait for the word somehow. That's how you know things get really terrible. Further talk about billions slipping off the keyboard. Anything these people did, one way or the other, was going to cause massive transfers of wealth. When in doubt, cut the number by half. Scientific and technical, no doubt. All right, spot the word somehow. Dale said 1.1% implies $1 trillion in Social Security savings over 10 years. Now, in other words, 10 years is a nice round number. $1 trillion, it does not get much rounder than that. You back out what number you would have to find in order to get the round number of savings over the round number of years, and that turns out not to be round. Next, search for the definite article. Somehow, our separate efforts came up with the 1.1% bias number. But Zvi and I didn't question the substitution part, and Mike, Dale, and Ellen didn't question the 0.6 quality change part. That was the rumor that we heard as to why we were being slammed by 2 of these 5 commissioners. That there was a target, and that anything that cast doubt on the substitution bias was going to blow that target off course, hence was not acceptable. I don't know if I'm reading this right, but one of the things that I find stunning is that I think I am the first person in the United States to comment loudly on this PowerPoint presentation. Those of you on the web, go look it up at Robert Gordon's site and tell me what you think. Because this is tantamount scientifically to malpractice as far as I'm concerned. There was certainly a lack of review. what the rumor was that the Senate Finance Committee did not want to pay the price politically for touching the third rail of politics. If you touch Social Security entitlements and Medicare, Medicaid, you die. If you raise taxes, you die. And so the idea was, instead of actually paying a price by being politically accountable, we could get a scientific group to break a gauge, to do the wealth transfers that we wanted done, that they wanted done. And the only problem would be that an input to many of our formulas would be adjusted by some random amount, like $1 trillion over 10 years. All right? So that 1.1% is now going to factor itself in to all of the equations that we might have that mention a price level and its rate of change. Well, we didn't know all that then. So in 1996, we got only a tiny description of how this supposed 1.1% was going to be justified. And the idea is very simple. They gave a short little example with exactly two goods, chicken and beef, and they said, here, you have two periods. In the first period, you have purchases where you purchase equal quantities of chicken and beef, and then prices shift, and there are non-equal purchases of chicken and beef. And the question is, what is the right amount in this toy example to say the rate of inflation is, given that the economy is dynamic? Now, what they said was that the right thing to do was to look at these curves. Now, the nonlinear curves are called indifference curves. They're a wonderful construct, and they represent quantities, baskets of chicken and beef, for whom a particular consumer would be indifferent. The level sets of a hypothetical function that doesn't exist, if you will. The hypothetical function was once called the cardinal utility function, but because cardinal utility was thought to be silly, what does it mean to be 7 utils happy? We simply go with the level sets and we don't bother ourselves with the real valued function. So the idea is that if I originally consumed at A and prices changed when this budget curve is tangent to the indifference curve at the point A, and prices then moved to a different percentage, I would be paid to consume at a level that would allow me to jump to a higher indifference curve. I would become happier because I would not purchase my old basket. I would purchase a new basket that is more sensational and fantastic. And that is a mistake, because what I really should be compensated for is the ability to consume at the point B, which is the point where the linear and nonlinear submanifolds or hypersurfaces oscillate. So this difference was largely thought to provide this massive transfer of wealth, that this was the overstatement. Now, there's only one problem with that. That's no way to base a system of national indicators. This representative consumer, first of all, probably doesn't mean a whole lot the way it's constructed. If you think about Arrow's impossibility theorem, if we all have different preferences, to what extent can we aggregate those preferences to create a super consumer or a representative consumer? But also, we spend vast amounts of money on advertising to push people's preferences around, we think. Well, what happens if I begin consuming at the point A, at a later time I consume at the point B because I've been compensated and I remain on my first curve, then my preferences shift while I continue to consume at the point B, and then I shift and consume at the point C. Well, A and C are collinear. So if I'm as happy with A as B, and then later I'm as happy with B with C, that means, in some sense, it looks like I should be as happy with A with C, but C is just better. As you can see at the top, the definition of economics began to change. As these problems were better understood, the definition of economics becomes more defensive. It starts to say, look, we are going to spike out these problems from the outset. We are not going to let them occur in the theory, so we are going to define them out of the theory by fiat. combined assumptions of maximizing behavior, market equilibrium, and stable preferences. This is in an economy with tons of advertising. Used relentlessly and unflinchingly, yikes, form the heart of the economic approach. I should say that in biology, in the theory of selection, we often use things unflinchingly. But we try not to use them relentlessly because we make mistakes, even the best of us. And it's important to have a sense of modesty when you are using something unflinchingly, but it may be having consequences that don't agree with what you expected. So, here is an amazing fact. Imagine that an economist is telling you things about your life and your motivations and what you do, and you don't like it. You can ask them one question. How does your theory of welfare work when my preferences change? Well, there is no currently accepted theory of welfare analysis under changing preferences. This is why we are assumed to have preferences that are unchanging. And I think this is a pretty mind-blowing paragraph by a pretty terrific economist. In the social sciences outside of neoclassical economics, the assumption has never been accepted by anyone. Well, that's pretty impressive. You've got to be pretty confident of yourself to call yourself an imperial discipline and invade subjects that don't accept this thing. In fact, von Weizsäcker gives the fundamental question. How can we evaluate an economic system with a measuring rod that itself changes with the system? If we allow preferences to change, and we're trying to use humans as the fixed ruler to judge economic performance, if humans are moving around, don't we have a problem that is insurmountable? Now, I will point out, very oddly, that this von Weizsäcker is the son of the famous physicist von Weizsäcker. And this description here is almost identically Hermann Weyl's theory of gauge from, 1917, 1919, something around there. Right? I mean, it's kind of stunning that there's something in the zeitgeist, in the Volksgeist, rather. Okay. I consider this to be perhaps the most stunning claim ever, and we really need to deal with it because a lot of what is called economic imperialism rests on the work of Gary Becker and the extension, and this was joint work with Becker and Stigler, two of the most revered Chicago economists. Tastes neither change capriciously nor differ importantly between people. On this interpretation, one does not argue over taste for the same reason that one does not argue over the Rocky Mountains. Both are there, will be there next year too, and are the same to all men. If this is true, it's certainly one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science, and I see no reason to be modest about it. Right? Let us go to the top of the Rocky Mountains and cry it out and see what the biologists tell us is true. I mean, I'm colorblind, and I don't like Impressionism. I don't think any amount of education is going to change that. Some people tell me that when they eat cilantro, it tastes like soap. Is it really true in a meaningful fashion? I can imagine that what he's trying to say is that we're all humans and that each one is a different instantiation of some sort of abstract class called human. But if that's what he's saying, then certainly the instances are nowhere nearly comparable. Either it's vacuous, right, or it's wrong, or it's an amazing discovery. So Pia Milani and I showed that what Boskin wanted to do was actually surprisingly possible. We thought we were helping them. From our perspective, we were making a giant deposit at the bank. We just didn't realize it was the same day that the tellers were robbing the bank, and it was really poorly timed. Now, if you see what's going on with Nesmith's comment, he says a time-varying objective function generally cannot be tracked by an economic index. There is no opportunity if preferences change to define this overstatement because one part of the overstatement doesn't exist. This held true since the early 70s when Franklin Fisher and Carl Schell, who I think are terrific, said the definition of the true cost of living index depends crucially upon the choice of a single indifference map. If the welfare comparison problem were the question which the true cost of living index answers, then it would be apparent that no meaning could be attached to such an index when tastes change. So what is the opportunity to even define this overstatement if this concept is so incredibly brittle? So what Boskin wanted to do was impossible without the Weinstein approach, unless you assume that preferences are 100% totally static. Take the example in the Boskin Commission report with chicken and beef. They don't give us enough information to know the preferences. So let's do what we always do in this situation, which is make the simplest assumptions possible. The simplest assumption possible is something called Cobb-Douglas preferences. You raise the amount of beef to the alpha and the chicken to the 1 minus alpha, and you draw the level sets of that, right? Cobb-Douglas preferences. Now you assume that the alpha exponent is interpolates linearly, as do the prices, okay? If you do that, you find out that that simple example has changing preferences, and the theory doesn't exist, even in the Boskin Commission's own report. So they cannot calculate anything. On the other hand, through our methodology, you can calculate that it's 2 to the 10 thirds over 5 to the 37 27ths. So this, to answer Romer's question, is a theory that is directly applicable. And even the toy example is not doable. And I challenge, I challenged Dale Jorgensen to explain what the theory is that he was trying to do for preferences that change. Let's have this out as a debate. How many empty chairs is my question? What? Dozens. Well, no. Sooner or later, it's going to be worth somebody's while to engage. But also, I think it's worth thinking about the way in which these people see the value of their work. It's by the amount that is affected, not necessarily whether it's done correctly, poorly, carefully. The fate of Social Security was decided at the dining room table in Jacksonville, Florida, at my wife's cousin's house. Were you there? I wasn't invited. I don't think that's right. In general, if the fate of Social Security is being decided, I want to be in the room, or I want somebody I trust in that room, even if I can't be in that room. This is not the way to go about doing things with 5 people who are unelected and appointed for a very specific task out of view of the rest of us, where we don't have the ability to let our votes say what we want. Now remember I told you I thought Paul Romer was in many ways a fantastic economist? Here's Romer's critique of changing preferences. His concern is that this is so important because if people are not allowed to become familiar with the environment and therefore value the environment, we are going to find self-defeating policies which take people who spend too much time indoors and they're not going to value the environment and they're going to use their votes poorly and they're going to choose to do things that despoil the environment, thereby creating more people who ruin the environment. And he claims that that economic theory is ill-equipped to handle policy questions in this area by virtue of its assumption that preferences are exogenous, given, and unchanging. Right on. Right? This is from inside the field. And Paul is one of the relatively few people to say this cleanly. I should say he said this with co-author Herb Gintis, who's also a really interesting guy to keep track of. Okay. So this isn't personal yet. It gets worse. I don't want to be impolite, but you have to think about how this looks to me. Imagine that a bunch of economists ask for millions of dollars from the federal government to help fix computer science so that its graduates will stop producing buggy programs, and then ask you to come listen to them bitch about code writing and CS education, even though they have almost no understanding of either. All right. Sigh. You'll notice that there's a lot of this writing of exclamations into written speech. Okay, I don't appreciate this. No understanding? Let's do this thing. I don't mean to be rude, Paul, but do you understand enough to solve these problems? Do you understand gauge theory on fiber bundles, principal bundles, and infinite dimensions? Do you understand the role of curvature and the importance of propagating probability distributions that remain with integral 1. Do you know how to do that as well as the physicists? I don't. But if the representative consumer is meant to mean anything, it's probably not a particular preference map. It's probably a probability distribution over preference maps from which we take a poll, right? That would mean that the underlying theory wasn't so far off. It just hasn't been properly instantiated. Now, if you economists know and well understand how to propagate wave functions on infinite dimensional spaces, geh gesund, be my guest, right? But the fact is that I know that that expertise lies outside the field. And I certainly am going to go run to the physicists and consult them just the way I'm going to run to the biologists when it comes to building a sensible model of an agent. So my feeling is, let's turn the competency question around. I'm going to send you a letter, Paul, wherever you are, and I want it critiqued. You are the head of the preference network for the MacArthur Foundation. You're one of the leading experts on preferences in economics. I want a critique of my work, and I want it on the air so that everybody can see it. And if you want to see the letter that I'm going to send to Paul, send me an email at economicmanhattanproject@gmail.com, and I will send you a copy of it, and we can all go through the exercise together. But otherwise, if your name isn't Bob Trivers or Ed Witten, don't talk to me like this, okay? I don't take this from them because they respect me, and I don't want to take it from you. Funny story about this issue involving Sherwin Rosen. Sherwin Rosen was a prominent Chicago economist and myself. And I was called to the National Academy of Sciences to be a discussant on his paper. And I was very, very focused on the importance to revitalize American science and engineering education. More excitement, more risk-taking, more responsibility to give to young people, more emphasis on breakthrough ideas and less emphasis on scientific product that can be churned out year after year at a constant rate. I have deeply held beliefs about this, and I think we're doing a terrible disservice to ourselves by not understanding the role of breakthrough science relative to science that can be done dependably. Sherwin Rosen appeared not to have studied scientists, but have studied cows. And one of the things that economists love to do, and sometimes it's really a good service, is to needle you and force you to think about things in terms that you find offensive, and then you later see the point of what they're thinking about. So his theory was that the scientific labor market should be treated the same as cattle cycles. Raise them, milk them, breed them, and kill them. The idea being that there's obviously a lot of merit there. The life cycle looks somewhat similar. Pardon me?
He's not a scientist?
No, he's not a scientist.
You have to breed them before you can milk them.
Yeah.
Sorry. If you're dyslexic cows, but I had heart, right? Okay. The only problem with this theory is that scientists don't produce product the way cows produce product, right? They're really complicated objects, and this simplification destroys most of what is interesting about scientists: their care, their feeding, and their tending. So it was not a clever use of an existing model because there are very few observables that can survive that kind of destruction of information given how violent it is in the system. So I decided I was a nice guy, and I said, I'm not going to engage this ridiculous idea. I'm instead going to point out that I've found evidence that the National Science Foundation and the National Academy of Sciences were actually coordinating efforts to try to lower rather than raise the wages for scientists and engineers on behalf of scientific and engineering employers. And that was pretty remarkable. It was the only talk in an academic conference to get a loud applause that went on for some time. Rosen blew a fuse, and he said, I was impudent and rude, and he was huffing and puffing on the way to the airport because I had broken sacred academic rules that said I should listen to his theory of cattle cycles. Economists are the worst offenders of what Paul is talking about, right? Now, we tolerate it when they actually have something to say. I don't mind if the economists come into my field and tell me something I don't know. I don't think you would mind if the economists come and tell you something you don't know about computer programming or hardware or something else. There are plenty of insightful things. This is a wrong idea of the world. It's just simply wrong. I believe that if I come in as a finance guy and talk to you guys about my needs for software engineering, you're going to listen. And if you guys talk to me about what it is that you want to do with computers and what we should be thinking about in finance differently, I certainly care to listen. There's something wrong with this idea that these are sacred boundaries that must not be transgressed. All right, what do these tourists do? Well, here's an example from the physics literature. If you were reading physicsworld.com, you'd be reading about predictions for the housing market crashing, coming from people who had predicted crashes in the UK. The fact of the matter is that physicists are very interested in systems and want to know whether their analogies and whether their experiences can work. So I don't think this tourism thing is a bad thing at all. Why not let these guys, they seem to have done all right for themselves. From the same proposal to the MacArthur Foundation, here is a very good critique of this perspective. Economics, by contrast, has steadfastly held to the older notion that the integrity of a scientific discipline is measured by its degree of isolation from other disciplines. I agree with that guy. In 2002, I received, or maybe this was 2001 actually, I received a phone call from a friend in Manhattan. And he said, we've got some problem with mortgage-backed securities. I said, I don't know anything about mortgage-backed securities. He said, let me explain the problem. So he explained the problem, and we argued about it, we're good friends, for half an hour. And at the end of the half an hour, we had a solution, we thought. Good enough. Von Neumann Morgenstern, right, to the rescue. And we wrote it up, got some formulas, and we sent it off to Risk Magazine, which is a peer-reviewed journal in finance, their cutting-edge section. They said, we love it. We're really concerned about these mortgage-backed securities, and nobody has any analytic, sensible way of pricing them. Finally, maybe they're not so hard to price after all. And you got this picture, and the idea was that the uncertainty spreads out, the variance widens out at various points, and that in the von Neumann Morgenstern framework, you should get a discount on the price of the object as it becomes more uncertain, right? Just the way you would if you think about this from the perspective of a quantum analogy. You've got something that you previously thought was a point price, a classical price. In fact, it's better modeled as a wave function. You don't know where the price is exactly, but you might have a guess as to how it is distributed. And when you actually do an observation, what do we call that? We call it price discovery. And you get a collapse. And it collapses to the point where it actually traded. So that analogy told us that we needed to find the right classical approximation that took care of the discount. We came up with this picture. Why did we come up with this picture? Because we were terribly worried that this illiquidity was being used to fool people, investors, auditors, accountants, right? So what the quants were doing back then was trying to do some amount of public-spirited research saying, we got a problem here, and if we don't watch it, these instruments are going to come and get us because there's too much opportunity to say, gosh, the prices are spread out so they could be just about anywhere. Right? As if that's an option, to mark things wherever it is that you feel they should be marked. What's the reward for this public-spirited behavior? You end up in the New York Times under a headline like, they tried to outsmart Wall Street. Now, because I've dealt with the press a few times, I had them put me next to this graph. Because that graph is not there to help me trade or make a profit. That graph is there to help you keep your life savings, me keep my life savings, because this is dangerous stuff. And the fact is, when somebody tells you, we can't price these difficult to price assets, woe is me, you tell them, go put valuation of illiquid assets into Google, and one of the top papers that will come up, and what was until recently the top paper, was this paper from 2002. You've had people worrying about this for a long time. Use the methodology. Alpha versus Schmalpha. Timothy Geithner, I remembered that name. Here he is in 2004 feeling sunny about the world, saying, you know, we do need to worry about these systemic crises, but on balance, the positive aspects dominate the less positive. Shocks may act more quickly, but they can be more easily diffused and absorbed. Institutions and markets seem better positioned to handle a substantial degree of stress. Shocks may be less likely to result in the type of trend-amplifying, signal-reinforcing dynamics for sustained periods of time that can threaten stability of the financial system. Okay, let's talk about selection and adverse selection. I don't know who I am. I'm just some guy. Is this the person you want at the helm? Is this the best person for this job? I mean, I'll take that he's got tons of expertise. I'll take that we want him on our team. But is this the right person to be running the show? Same time, I was running around like a chicken with my head cut off saying, we've got a real problem out here. We have got terrible analytics. The analytics are being gamed. And the fact of the matter is that this system is going to be a threat to those of us who make their money in the financial markets, to investors. And I don't want to make my money this way. I got a decent enough life as it is. I don't need to participate in this. So we define schmalfa to be excess value extracted not from the capital markets, but from the investors in the capital markets. And the idea is that schmalfa is easy to create if the analytics are all messed up. So these mortgage-backed securities with these big, wide regions of uncertainty with no methodology for pricing are a place where schmalfa is going to collect. And in fact, you get this crazy notion. Instead of having a haircut, a discount, because of this extra risk, you in fact have a premium because there is more ability to hide. So that things that are more opaque command some kind of a premium because the people who are going to manage the assets are dying to have more freedom to mark things wherever they want rather than having their hands tied. So what we were predicting that we would get people providing alpha and schmalpha together. In the same presentation, I tried to explain, somebody had explained to me, I didn't originally know him as Bernie Madoff, I knew him as the Jewish T-bill. And in looking at his returns, said, this is really frightening stuff. Why don't you want to be involved with this guy? I didn't know how it worked, but I knew that there was something really troubling. So I changed the name to Black Arts Capital because there's black rock, black stone, black this, black that. And we tried to come up with a methodology which explained that the more uncertainty there is in a strategy that might go up and up and up, the more you have to average over both the risk and the uncertainty, leading to smaller allocations. Not that you shouldn't allocate, but that you shouldn't allocate large amounts. Okay, now I want to shift. Why am I a fan of derision? Well, in my world, which is the universities of 1970 and before, there was a fair amount of derision, but it wasn't nearly as ubiquitous as it is today, in my opinion. Because we have a lot of stories from this time, and the stories frequently end with paradigm shifts, right? The stories that we retain, that subset that's still interesting to us, show that people are willing to engage in this kind of stuff when they are at a cusp. So the first one I want to do is Chargraph to Watson and Crick. So he writes that they impressed me by their extreme ignorance, and he writes that they were two pitchmen in search of a helix. And you can see here that he's having a tremendous degree of difficulty dealing with the fact that they have published this double helix in Nature. And I want to point out that the note of Watson and Crick amused me no end. I think there's as much truth in that statement as that Paul is too busy to come here. What you see is that Chargraph goes into the history books as an appendage to Watson and Crick, which is unfair to him, right? This is the man who figured out what the pairings were between the nucleotides that had to be constant or equimolar. And he did a tremendous amount of good work and was instrumental in the field. But the fact of the matter is that he took a huge risk in engaging in derision. And unfortunately, that's where he ends up in the history books today. And I urge you to look at some of his writings because there's a tremendous amount of grace and insight that is still left in them. But the fact is we trifle with derision at our peril. Here's another important instance. That RO is Robert Oppenheimer, and nolo contendere is what he was writing to Freeman Dyson, because he had been very vocal in shooting down Dyson's work, trying to popularize what Tominaga, Schwinger, and Feynman had done, and not only popularize. I mean, it needs to be said that he was tremendously insightful and added a great deal of his own. And he fought, and he took the scorn, and he talks about having Oppenheimer coming down on him like a ton of bricks. Now, what's the result when finally this two-word capitulation comes? This is how we did things back then. This is the world I want to return to, where you take risk. I gave a talk at Perimeter Institute called Sheldon Glashow Owes Me $1. Now, Sheldon Glashow is kind of a hero of mine. And he does owe me $1, and I'm going to get that dollar sooner or later. But the fact of the matter is that it is terrible when we allow people to take pot shots at people, but don't force them to go short, right? And one of the alternate titles for that talk was Go Long, Go Short, or Get Out of My Way. The fact is, Oppenheimer shorted Dyson, shorted Feynman, shorted Schwinger. And when he lost, he paid up. He wasn't gambling with an account that wasn't his. The fact of the matter is, this is how science gets done. And when we talk about the scientific method, we often don't talk about the modality by which these decisions actually occur. Another favorite story of mine is Victor Lemaire, who was apparently not a very progressive man. And Isidore Rabi, who's a huge hero of mine, didn't like what he was doing, I guess. I think he was seeking to put a lot of pressure on communists at Columbia, who Rabi thought were good scientists. And at some point, Julian Schwinger, as a very awkward young man, took Lemaire's chemistry course. And Lemaire decided to needle Rabi and says, you know, this guy you say is so smart, such a genius, he's failing my chemistry class, let alone physics, he's failing chemistry. And Rabi did something very unusual. He said, well, if he's really failing, what are you, a man or a mouse? Give him an F. And he pushed Lemaire to give Julian Schwinger an F. And forever after, we will know Victor Lemaire as the man who gave Julian Schwinger an F. This is the way these games got played. I think that it's not pretty to watch, but there is a certain sort of poetic justice, and things did happen that do not happen as commonly in our time. So, what is the EMP? Well, I have chosen to be a behind-the-scenes person, more or less, up until now. I don't like the limelight. I don't like talking about my views because they're very often not close to the mainstream. But I started noticing that people feel powerless. They're waiting for the government to do something. They're waiting for some body to do something. And these bodies in the government are very, very compromised. There's a tremendous amount of regulatory capture. We all know that. And what I don't understand, and this genuinely mystifies me, is why we don't do something more like the open source community. We got the degrees. We got the stuff. This stuff is cheap, right? We can sign people up. We got tons of technical talent. And I don't see that the guys who are called in to do this crisis, and the gals, have anything special over the tremendous body of talent that is suffused throughout the universities. So the question is, why are we simply holding still and letting this happen? Right? It's learned helplessness on a broad scale. I don't know what to do, but I know that if we started to do something, if we started to assemble names, if we started to put pressure on our government, these people at the top are not so special as intellects. Larry Summers is incredibly bright. He's very gifted. He's a good thinker. He's a good speaker. But he doesn't possess anything that is that rare that he should be in every scene of every play, right? Timothy Geithner, I don't understand. He's made some bad calls. And he's done some things pretty poorly. Can't we get him as a supporting actor? Is it possible to find somebody with actual predictive power that we could give the top slot to? So think about how you feel about the AIG retention bonuses. Why was it at this 2004 meeting in which all the big investment banks say, please let us do our leverage because we have the math and the chops to do it? Do you know how many people objected? computer consultant in Indiana named Len Bolet. I called him up and I said, you know, you're the only guy who was there when this thing happened? He says, yeah. You know, he's very, very timid about the whole thing. But the fact is he's kind of a hero, right? At every turn, for every Madoff, there was a Markopolis. For every leverage meeting, there was a Len Bolet. I don't see any situation in which this was so unpredictable that no one emerged. But there was an odd feature, which is that the credential differential was always going the wrong way. We have a huge problem with the credentialism. And so what I'm trying to say is those of us whose credentials do not come from this world, who do not need to seek its approval, have a job to do. If you have the skills, if you have the math, if you have the computer talents, and the fact is these guys can't touch you, why don't you lend a hand? Just a small percentage of your time. Get on a list. Let's figure out how, at some level, to make the point that this isn't hurting for lack of brain power. So what's the idea behind the EMP? First of all, aside from economics, the quantitative hard sciences are more or less interoperable. I deal regularly with physicists, mathematicians, biologists, not so much chemists. I deal regularly with computer folks. In general, if we have the interest and the time, we can hop from field to field to field. We learn a little bit of new language, but the discipline is the same. It's a very familiar milieu. That is not true for economics. Many people who go into economics come out of there screaming. They say, you know, it looks like science, it should behave like science. I don't understand which part of the conversation something gets lost. In the world's markets, we have suffered a total systemic failure, which was very difficult to time. I'm not saying that I had any predictive power over when this thing would happen. In fact, I could tell you I thought it was going to blow in 2002, and had I gotten more information earlier, I probably would have put the date earlier. But the fact of the matter is that we were playing with fire was completely clear. The voices warning of financial disintegration were primarily concentrated outside the heart of the credentialing system. Why is that? What is it about these credentials that caused people to quiet themselves, to second guess themselves? Because I can tell you when I was going to these conferences and I was raising my voice, I was doing it relatively timidly. And very often the only other guy there was Nassim Taleb. Right? And people would treat him, they would say he's a self-promoter, he's a broken record, he's a one-trick pony, doesn't have any insight, et cetera, et cetera. One, I don't think that's true. If you listen carefully to what he says, he's got a lot to say. And two, you got to say something for the guts and the grit to stand up in a room full of people and tell them all they don't know what they're talking about year after year with absolutely no encouragement from the markets that you know what you're talking about. It's a particular characteristic. You know, and I think about one of the analogies in computers that moves me is what does it take to build a beautifully designed system? Where does the system's architecture? Well, the one thing I know a little bit about, not very much, is Python. And what it takes is, in general, the ability to stay with a design sense when you're the only person who really understands the bigger implications, to listen very carefully, to integrate good ideas, to take account of your mistakes, and to also stand up when it's not a popular decision, knowing that it's the right thing to do down the road. And so, you know, my feeling is that what Guido has done with Python is very much what we need to do with systems architecture for the financial system. We need to find some organizing principle so that we don't have this incredibly Byzantine and Baroque system where every little curlicue is different from one place to the next. We need simple organizing principles that are generally operable. So one day I realized that no one I trusted was being called in, and I started dialing the numbers of the people I know who had spoken up. And I said, has anybody from the government called you? Nope. Well, you spoke up, 4 years ago. Well, nobody's called. Okay. Next number. You were saying this 3 years ago. Anybody called you? No, I haven't heard anything. You think they're going to call me? Nobody even expects to be called. If you're outside of this circle, in general, nobody expects to be called no matter how much predictive power you had. Now, why are we doing that? Well, here goes. We have actually reached a point where you cannot afford to have the technically gifted at the table. The technically gifted, there's something called it. Now, I can't tell you what it is because I don't get it. And my guess is that you don't get it, or you wouldn't be here. If you got it, you'd probably be somewhere else. When you talk about, does he get it? He doesn't get it. You know, that guy really gets it. This it is not a good thing. We need more people who don't get it, who will raise their hand and say, I don't get it. Well, I don't get it. We need people who understand that this is how the game is being played. We are seeking solutions that obscure the problem. We don't have a problem with assets that are too difficult to value. We have the problem that assets may be valuable under current methodology. And we need to make sure that we don't consult people who might have the ability to value those assets. Because otherwise, we might have insolvent banks. Now, I don't know what happens if you have insolvent banks. And in fact, there is some thought that maybe you need some degree of deception. Small amounts of deception are present in life, right? But if you're talking about restoring confidence to the system, you certainly don't want to have to go to confidence men who specialize in confidence, right? So the key point is that what we need to do is to understand why it is that this technical elite, right? We used to give, let's say my undergraduate institution was headed by a physicist in the 1950s, I think. This idea that now you need lawyers, you need economists, you need people who are schooled in the art of the possible, rather than people who actually deeply, deeply, deeply get it, and it is something much more important than the it that these guys are talking about back in the game. So we have two basic approaches that are open to us. The first one is tempting almost everyone. Let's expel economics from the sciences. To hell with them. They don't know what they're talking about. Right? It's a feel-good. Right? They screwed us over. Now we get a chance to respond. It's the wrong instinct. I don't believe it. Let's embrace economics more deeply. At some level, you've got this incredibly souped-up motorcycle with training wheels. Right? You've got pseudoscientific training wheels. Let's take them off and see what happens. Maybe we can ride it, maybe we can't. I don't know. Let's figure out the disconnection between what looks like a scientist and what looks like a science and what behaves like a science. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever spent time in a brothel. In fact, I used to get my hair cut in a brothel. It did not look like what a brothel should be in my mind. I thought a brothel would have velvet curtains, people lounging around. Instead, the brothel that I used to get my hair cut in Cambridge, Massachusetts, had a Harvard-oriented antique store on one side. The proprietor's owner, the owner's child used to play on the floor. I think it started out as a barbershop. But at some point, it grew this secondary business. And there were always sort of mysterious goings-on, things that didn't quite make sense. Right? Now, the fact of the matter is that economics is like that. There is a hardcore science which is playing the role of the barbershop. There's good stuff, quality people, terrific theorems, great data, lots of insight to be had. And there's this other thing that has grown behind this science. And I have nothing against the brothel. I just want to disconnect the two. Right? Because my barbershop closed, and I cannot get my hair cut in Cambridge, Massachusetts by a guy who I thought really did a nice job for me, because of this other thing was threatening the enterprise, right? So my point is that what we need to do is to try to apply scientific method, scientific modesty. We don't need everything to work. Lord knows many of our theories spent time in the doldrums before we finally got the kinks out and got the agreement with experiment so that we could claim that we were on the right side of Popper, right? But the fact is that economics is telling us, and mostly it's telling the social sciences, we are a science. Well, let's take it on its own terms. And let's do it with modesty and with grace. And let's try to help them get to where they want to go as a science. But let's also not forget ourselves and not surrender ourselves to their peer review process, approval by their chosen organs. Let's take some of what functions in math and physics and biology and use that to critique what these people are doing and to help them along. So I want you to think about the acronym ARM as we wind up. One, we need to think about agency. What is our model for the actors, and what fidelity does it lose when we come up with a model? In general, what I believe is that economics has abstract classes. And they're not supposed to be directly instantiated. They're supposed to be subclassed because the models are too far away from the real world. If you think about DNA, right? DNA, the model, and what it is a model of are so close that you almost forget that there's any distance between them. Same thing with quantum field theory, right? Maybe it's not calculus and linear algebra all the way down, but we've never gotten to that level where we don't see that, right? The distance in economics is far more considerable. But what you have is people doing two good models of Europe and then saying, based on my model of Europe, I recommend the following trade practices. Well, that kind of direct implementation is obviously a problem. We need to come up with some kind of discipline that forces people to think about the distance. Regulation. One of the things I don't understand is that economists very clearly understand that if you start to mismanage a bank, eventually you'll lose depositors to a bank that is better managed, or you'll lose investors or what have you. But the process, the cost of this kind of self-regulatory behavior is so enormously different from one case to the next that we shouldn't be indifferent to what the kind of expected self-regulation is. The fact that things self-correct isn't enough. We need to know what kind of violence is that self-correction going to entail, and whether it's better to be done at an external level or to have it as a self-regulating system. Lastly, measurement. Measurement is not terribly glamorous. Most of us, are accustomed to the idea that we, drop a thermometer into a pool of water and we can get an accurate reading. Many of these gauges, as I hope I showed you before with the price indicator, are subject to all kinds of assumptions where the gauge may not be measuring at all what we think it's measuring. And so it may be a very faulty input into the model. I once went to a talk with Kathy Abraham from the BLS where she said, I'm not sure whether this is a talk about why American workers are doing so well, why they've stagnated, or why they've fallen behind so badly, because the sensitivity to how we measure inflation is really quite extreme. Well, that's what we need. That's the kind of honesty that we want in the system. If things are that sensitive, that somebody should come and say, I've done a model of this system, but the sensitivity analysis precludes me from giving strong recommendation because the error bars are simply too wide. We need an ignorance-based model of the world. We are almost certainly going to fail in Dennis's attempt at first to model the economy. We are going to lose a tremendous amount of fidelity. We have a very simple principle, right? Which is the more you don't know about a system, the more redundancy and the higher the reserves are that you need, right? So we should start out from the possibility that we don't need to succeed in a modeling endeavor in order to make an impact. If we simply know how much we failed by, we can set aside reserves that keep us from getting into dangerous territory, right? If you think about the principle by which a cheetah kills, the cheetah may have the fastest land speed of any predator. However, what is its why doesn't everything adopt the cheetah strategy? Because if a cheetah fails too often, it's going to starve to death because it has no reserve capacity. So it's on some kind of frontier, and in fact, we cannot afford to have all our banks tricked out as cheetahs when in fact there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the world and we don't have a broad enough base in order to afford it. It is absolutely imperative that we stop working up from the consumer. What we know about human beings is that they have all sorts of substructure. Genotype, phenotype, germ, soma, ultimate preferences versus proximate preferences. And modeling an addict as someone making a really interesting consumer decision is probably not a good idea. We have a lot of information about who we are, where we've come from. We need to go talk to the folks who do selection. We need to talk to the Dick Alexanders of the world. We need to go talk to the Bob Trivers of the world. And if they don't agree with our models and they tell us, no, you've got it all wrong, we need to listen. And I would love not to be the one debating Gary Becker. I'd love to have Bob Trivers do it if we can get him, right? But I'm willing to do it. The fact is that it needs to be that economics is part of the sciences. We think that economics is right to posit self-interested decision-making by individuals, but without the refinements, it can go dangerously astray. Economics is now under a tremendous amount of pressure to abandon its core insights. Some of those core insights are disturbing, like the fact that agents are selfish, right? And that it tends to be the individual that makes decisions. Those things are not wrong. In general, those things are correct. But if you don't have genotype, so that you have inclusive fitness in Hamilton's rule, you're not going to get all sorts of goodies. Now, the economists know about a lot of the adjustments to economic theory. But what they have is a core and a wide periphery. And if you try to change the core, they'll tell you, we already know about that, and it's stuck in the periphery. And you say, well, is the periphery binding? It's not. In other words, you have plenty of evolutionary models. You know tremendous amounts about psychology. But the fact of the matter is that not all of that stuff gets brought to bear on a problem. If it's lodged somewhere, the idea is we already know about it. But that's not what we want. We want these great insights to start to percolate into the core of the discipline. We believe that really good system architecture means working with Lego. The great part of the core of economics is that it is made with this interoperable Lego so that things snap together and there's this tremendous vertical building. What we are in danger of is that the core is lacking certain insights and the periphery is too baroque and it doesn't fit together properly. So this is, again, the analogy with Python. We also believe that you have to deal with simplifications. One of the great lessons from renormalization theory in physics is that at each strata of effective field theory, there are certain questions you're not allowed to ask because they're sensitive to variables in the model which are not well understood. Right? Now, I don't get that as deeply as the physicists do, but the idea of partitioning the questions at any given level or model into that which is robust to the simplifications made and that which is highly sensitive and therefore invalid at that level of structure seems to me to be a very good discipline to take on. So one question is, can renormalization theory teach us how to deal with bad models and continue to get reasonable results from bad models, if you think about it from that perspective?
In fact, we're running out of time, so if you speed up quickly and get through. There you go.
He's my ride to the airport, so I can't really afford to. Okay. Anyone can join. I don't know what the Economic Manhattan Project is. We're meeting in Canada. We're going to talk about it. We aren't physicists because we're meeting at the Physics Institute. We're economists, physicists, accountants, computer programmers, private equity guys. All sorts of folks are going up there, and the idea is we're going to see what comes out of it. There isn't a tremendous amount of antagonism. There's a desire to build. But the key point is that we're not trying to come up with a monoculture. We are trying to figure out what is the discipline necessary so that economics fits in the right place and becomes interoperable with the other sciences. So send email, those of you following along at home, to economicmanhattanproject@gmail.com if you want a copy of the letter outlining this improved marginalism for economic theory. Send your name, specialty, and any way in which you would like to help. And hopefully, I'm short on time, but we'll find some way of organizing it. And if we can get enough people interested, we can tell people that we have a ton of great people ready to go if only we get the call, and then we'll find out what happens next in the conversation. Thank you for your time.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.